Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's staff seminar. My name is George Gona, and on behalf of the Department of History and Archaeology, I'd like to welcome you again to this continuing series of staff dialogues on various topics. This afternoon, Dr. Kenneth Ombongi will be speaking to us about the Unholy Trinity, land, electoral politics, and identity in Kenya. Dr. Ombongi is senior lecturer and head of department, head of the history department, University of Nairobi. Previously, he was the principal and chief executive at the Kenya Utalii College. He holds a PhD of the Cambridge University. Before that, he studied at Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, where he obtained an MPhil. And he is a graduate of the University of Nairobi with a BA and MA in history. Dr. Ombongi has interest in various aspects of history, including the history of biomedicine in Africa, which was his PhD area of study. He is also interested in statecraft as well as African politics. This afternoon, Dr. Ombongi will be speaking to us about the long-drawn historical process that has made Kenyans to take recourse into small spaces, or what he calls small social universes of identity, which partly explains the perpetual intersections of land, electoral violence, and identity. Let me take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Ombongi to speak to us on this very interesting topic. Thank you, Dr. Ombongi, welcome.
I have a cordless one. Thank you very much, Dr. Gona, for that introduction. Friends, it is really a pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. I welcome you all, those of us who are here in the University of Nairobi, here in our nation's capital. And I also welcome those who are watching us and listening to us online. And I want to believe that they are hearing us. Now, friends, in our new spirit of climbing down from the ivory tower, we said this last week, of the academy, I first tested the ideas that I'm going to present today at a workshop organized by the Kenya Land Alliance sometime last year in Eldoret. And I'm glad that we have a few friends from the Kenya Land Alliance who are actually following us from some from Nakuru, and most importantly, the CEO of the Kenya Land Alliance, Ms. Faith Olube, who is joined us from Kakamega, where she's on duty. And I would say, welcome, Madam Olube, and thank you for availing some of the materials that I've used in coming up with my presentation this afternoon. Now, the title of my presentation is The Unholy Trinity, Land, Electoral Politics, and Identity in Kenya. And I want to do 4 things in this presentation. First, I will generally highlight the central point, or rather the overall question I'm preoccupied with in this paper, and try just briefly to situate it within some historiographical context. Then 2, I will illustrate the connections of land, electoral violence, and identity, using a long-term historical view, which those of us from history, we call the longue durée, some kind of something like that. Number 3, I will demonstrate how land is tied to elections in ways that challenge the stability of Kenya as a country. And finally, I will draw some conclusions. Before I start, let me first begin with some kind of disclaimer. After we circulated an e-flyer for this series, a pastor friend of mine called me, sounding very anxious. Oh, Kenneth, you can't use the word Trinity on the same line with Unholy. He said, for sure you can't do that. And he sounded even more agitated, as we continued with our conversation. But I just want to say that in my understanding, and in the context I have used the title or the term Trinity, it is just simply an English word which means 3. It can be 3 people, 3 groups, 3 things, and so on. It has really nothing to do with the Christian Godhead of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. I thought you could say amen. It has really nothing to do with that. But as used here, Trinity really refers to the historical intersections of land as a commoditized and cultural category, violence as a feature in our electoral politics, and identity, which I will define as we go. So I thought that is important to make, and I guess the pastor I was speaking to, he promised that he would be following. I hope I've made that very clear. Now, having cleared the air on that one, in this presentation, I'm preoccupied with with the question of why land is so emotive an issue throughout Kenya's history. So emotive that in every election cycle, there is some form of violence, either directly or indirectly, associated with land. Omogondo in my first language. The phenomena that land is also so impassioned that sometimes lived experience of violence in Kenya are labeled as land clashes. I'm sure this is a term that we use very liberally in our everyday language. It isn't far-fetched to say that the lexical label, land clashes, is almost a refrain, a chorus of some kind in Kenya's unfortunate symphony of human choreographed violence in electoral politics. For example, it is not uncommon in the country's everyday language to talk of, Mount Elgon land clashes, Naivasha land clashes, Molo, land clashes. This is very familiar to me, actually, for some reasons. Likoni, land clashes. Enusupukia, land clashes. It's interesting that even Burnt Forest, a town in the central Rift Valley, for years might have escaped from the fire burning implied in its name, but not the land clashes. The Burnt Forest land clashes of 1992. Now, therefore, in this presentation, I'm making an attempt to examine what I see as conjunctions of this sensational natural resource land, election violence, and identities in Kenya. In a sense, it is a study of how the utility of land as a spatial embodiment is linked to processes of political governance, or of course, lack of them, and mediated by identities. Identities meaning how individuals or groups arrogate a socially constructed view of themselves in relation to others, which usually results in what I see as hierarchies of power, demands of entitlements, sometimes visions of the futures, among others. I deliberately, very deliberately, use the concept identities, the plural version of it, because in Kenya, I think just like elsewhere in Africa, identities are social constructs, primarily informed by historical processes, but normally they come in multiples. They are flux, and flexible, very elastic. They are created and recreated, negotiated and renegotiated. On this, I depended on Daniel Lynch's his work, and we saw this in Ngala Jome's presentation last time, in the case of racial identity in the coastal town of Mombasa. Now, these processes of reimagining who we are and the particular way or ways we were meant to be within a spatial entity we call land in relation to the architecture of state power really underwrites the essence of Kenya's social crisis, which in my view is so bad, so huge sometimes, and often so foreseeable, but nevertheless perpetual. We see it coming, we think we will prevent it, but still it reoccurs. For example, one can argue again that lived experience in Kenya is in some ways an embodiment of vivid and predictable patterns of violence in every election cycle. Always expectations of upheaval, some kind of state of anarchy. Others, call it the order of disorder. But in reality, it is also a plot in our collective conscience. Friends, that sounds very pessimistic, but I think it is true. That is our situation. You see, many extant studies of our situation generally draw upon tools of political science and others those of historical narratives, which richly enable them to delve into details of, specific contemporary periods. Delve into descriptions and analyses, and many of them give very interesting prescriptions. All these diagnostic studies, I see them as very diagnostic, advance a fairly atomized view of the Kenyan society, splitting it into smaller periods, sections or groups, or even subgroups. But I find this very purposive fragmentation, which seems to me to ignore long-drawn historical processes, which have informed the worldviews and trajectories that have led us to who we are today as a country, as a people, as communities, as groups, as we are today. And I see ourselves as somewhat callous people, fighting over land, shedding blood every election cycle. If I was in Kakamega, I would say Riswa. And those who come from that part of Kenya, you know what it means. And Professor Hunter, you need to ask somebody what that means, Riswa. These extant studies of our situation generally range from the structural functionalist conceptions, which are primarily, seeking to explain, structural ineffectiveness of liberal democracy in our setting. They also include the minimalist literatures, which bemoan the decimal hegemony of the state in Kenya's post-colony. And also they include the overly Afro-pessimists who are advocates of the general role of what is normally called instrumentalities of disorder in Kenya's polity, just like in much of the African continent. Now, my paper is an attempt to construct an explanation which hopefully, and I'm hoping, will help us to understand Kenya's complex situation in order to contribute to these literatures which have tried to, explain the country's crisis of decimal performance and proneness to violence. Friends, I propose a fairly broad historical view of things, of the Kenyan society. That is the view of long-term historical processes. My students of philosophy of history will call it longue durée, and how these processes cumulatively lead us into where we are. In doing this, I take into account the evolution of social order or disorder, if you like, as it is influenced by constantly changing clash or what I see as concordance of ideas of identity, varied institutional mutations, and trends of human conduct. So the first question I ask myself is, yes, we are in a crisis which have connections of land, electoral politics, and identity. But how has this developed, over a period of time? And that's a question I will attempt to answer. Kenya today is really a product of critical historical conjunctions, which in our time bear lexical labels of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. These fairly omnibus, large categories, in my view, presume a very fallacious historical discontinuity. In reality, however, I have a belief that there is a fundamental continuity, an interactable thread, literally, cutting across all these periods of Kenya's history, which have made sure that no essential change occurred at any one of them to alter institutions, influence relations, and ideas on which the African utilitarian identity or identities were, forged, flourished, and at times floundered, actually. When you read much of the pre-colonial Kenya histories, as handed down to us by nationalist historiography, and it is really wide. I've been reading all those old books of Professor Murioki, Professor God, Professor Mwansi, Professor Cheng, just trying to relook at things I read in my undergraduate days and try to understand them afresh. They're broad. But the picture we get, it's really one that reveals efforts in pre-colonial Africa, which set out to recreate, somewhat pre-colonial paradise, a paradise in which, bands of severers, semi-autonomous communities lived, and ICDA living from very diverse ecologies in ways that fostered exchange of farm and foraged produce, animals, and at times, at the risk of offending some, exchange of women and children, if not the voiceless. Communities were, supra categories, divided into clan, extended family, and other social constructs as gender. Relations within these segments were normally marked by intra-community competing interests over fame and ritual superiority in the ranks of warriors, rainmakers, fortune tellers, medicine men. You can continue the list. So segment identity was important in this setting in arrogating these folk resources that conferred one a position in the localized power hierarchies, such as the right to talk to the ancestors, and the living dead. It was not done by anybody and everybody. Inter-community relations were framed oftentimes through the prism of identities tied together by religious traditions and social control mechanisms. While the many ancestral values give priority and were integrative to those within the group or within the community, they gave no priority and were antagonistic to those outside the group or outside the community. This was the general setup into which the British imperial designs literally trust themselves in Kenya. From the socio-cultural perspective informing this analysis, I see colonialism essentially as a project of mega proportions, in quotes, mega proportions, which operated on somewhat enlarged scales of cross regions, cross reaches, cross communities, in comparison to the African small social universes of identity that we have seen above: family, kinship, clan, community, which were commonplace at the time. You know, in this sense, colonialism was mainly about spatial and social arrangements, you know, for European Celta economic expedience, as opposed to any meaningful transformation in all spheres of African life. You know, Africans were fundamentally left to their own devices in this environment, in their little, often insignificant and subordinate corners in the wider matrix of colonial economics, only until they caused sufficient trouble or abuivo, and they did so at times. We will see that in a little while. For example, they were not laborers in European farms. They were merely Christian converts, subservient subjects of the British crown. You know, in African reserves, always organized into bands of, you know, the so-called God's people, in stark contrast to their lost sheep compatriots who had not seen, quote unquote, the light, and were still stuck in sinful, in quotes, African folk culture. Now, in this setup of early colonial social order, African disparate groups could not effectively organize or mobilize in any meaningful political sense in times or in situations of discontent. If and when they did, they were either crushed by the maximum gun, literally, if not controlled, and co-opted into the colonial, what I called earlier, mega society, through Christian missions, you know, rudimentary colonial schools, low cadre employment, and other projects of token colonial African social development, which I'm sure many of us are well versed of. However, there was a sense in which Africans became what I see as a paradox of colonized people who were free. And I'm using the word free in quotes, despite you know, the state of colonial entanglement and constrictions. You know, it seems to me that while they imbibed the ideals of the colonial mega society and marketplace, Africans were usually, they did this within the prism of the more sustainable, more familiar, inward looking and intra-group frameworks of, you know, small social milieu of, they say, family, of clan or community, which essentially defined the reality through the lenses of identity of us and them, us and they, you know, ours and theirs. The goal, and there have been quite a few studies on this, the goal was the defining feature of intra-group efforts to literally prevent the flow of privileges across to other groups, or reserve the privileges of access to colonial goodies within the group. It is my argument, then friends, in this paper, that Africans maintained an amazing ability to take recourse to the world of small scales, social universes. You know, with a family, clan, sometimes generation and gender, in their understanding of lived experiences and the appropriation of social reality. Now, in the post-colonial period, just like in the previous period, little changed in my view, in the way Africans related to colonial institutions derived from colonialism, whether you're talking about government, what it understood as its mandate and the services it offered. Africans saw them through the lenses of what I'm calling small-scale universes, a word I've borrowed from an Indian sociologist. Therefore, in most cases, the neoliberal cliches of equality, you know, freedom and liberties as a means of accessing opportunities in Kenya, I think like elsewhere in the colonial empire, at least influenced African social orientation through much of Kenya's history. Not least being part of Kenya's cultural discourse and political values. I see these cliches of equality and the rest more just like the Indian sociologist Satish Sabharwal in his book Roots of Crisis, a Sociological Analysis of Modern India does on the Indian case as slogans for browbeating, intimidating authority. It's just slogans to intimidate governments, to give certain concessions. And in my view, in a sense, that's where they stop. In colonial Kenya, such a cliches, for example, served the nationalist cause. You know, a label invoked to evoke a sense of entitlement in our time. You know, nationalists, we fought for independence, we fought for rule, and therefore we are entitled to be more Kenyan than you. In post-colonial Kenya, such slogans of neoliberal thinking were deployed in the struggles against authoritarian regimes. But in my view, in essence, they have neither been sustainable nor viable in the country's political history or long-drawn historical traditions. I don't know whether we remember the case of the NAC minister. We are mourning President Kibaki, but if you remember during his administration, there was a minister of government one time when he was reminded that he was once a human rights champion outside government, but a human rights violator inside government. He said, you know, he retorted back and said, we were doing that to fight Moi. And when Moi went, that's it. There are people in here old enough who can remember that statement by that minister. You know, consequently, what we find is that strands of identity have endured diverse, you know, developments, trajectories, and governed Kenyans in the way they clamor for access to opportunities or the way they miss them. Therefore, what we find is that institutions of colonial derivation, as I alluded to earlier, whether you are talking about the state, parliament, police, whether you're talking about the courts, you know, are subordinate in a sense to the realities of the small-scale social universes of family, village, clan, community, in the appropriation of what I could loosely call global commons, social opportunities, and other things. But let me say that I'm not saying in any sense that the Kenyan society has remained static over the years. That's not my point. True, the Kenyan society has changed over the years in diverse trajectories, whether you're talking about during the colonial period, the post-colonial period, or any other period. But what is interesting to me is that there are fundamental continuities in identities and their constant creation and recreation, in which tie operations and functioning of society to what I'm constantly calling small-scale social universes of diverse identity. In my view, then, this explains the impollution occasioned by intersections of land, electoral politics, and identity, which I label here as the unholy Trinity, which I see as a teleology which might be an eye-opener in our understanding of a historical strand of fundamental rigidity in Kenya's society and polity. The continued appropriation of land through such a lenses of micro-social milieus compared to the universalizing norms in what I'm calling enlarged scales of the colonial mega society, ordinarily rendered it a sensitive issue in Kenya's history, electoral or otherwise. Therefore, historically, land, particularly to traditionally agrarian Africans, such as the Kikuyu, was both a cultural and economic currency. And Professor John Lonsdale has written a lot about this, and I saw him in the audience online. Land was both a cultural and economic currency. This was both to communities and individuals within the community. The ritual significance of land essentially lay in its connections with the configuration of the male's identity, the males, mainly men, identity, as dependable and respectable household heads. And I've stolen this from Lonsdale's works, what he calls civic virtue, which placed responsibility on the shoulders of the males to eat from the land by the sweat of their brow, and of course project masculinity by demonstrated ability to have and take care of dependents, both filial and social. Lonsdale has been writing about this for years. And that way they earned respect, what in his moral economy of Mau Lonsdale calls self-respecting independence, which he sees as a civic duty within a group or a community. Friends, a number of historians postulate that it was the breakdown of favorable conditions in the matrix on which men bargained for honor, with its consequence of socio-emotional heartbreak, that was the catalyst to Mau Mau revolt in the late 1940s. This included conditions that led to the dismal access to land and low labor wages, which generally left impoverished males struggling in a state of grinding poverty. And of course, we know that in the ensuing political struggle, ordinary people, the squatters in the so-called White Highlands and dwellers in Nairobi, African villages, took recourse to their familiar identity of the ethnic community. Furthermore, the fragmented control, what I see as fragmented colonial economics, underwrote and reinforced these structures of identity, particularly on the lines of race and ethnicity, which became very critical considerations in getting access to land, and the goodies, of course, are failed by the colonial setting. These, in my view, fed directly into the African's familiar territory, of identity. In essence, therefore, there was a way in which the whole colonial enterprise in Kenya was constructed and rested on this idea of social separation. In the enlarged scales of the colonial economic and social marketplace, in which land became a commodity, its utility and dialectics and struggles that came with it were mainly appropriated through the lenses of this social separation into the binary of white settlers and black squatters. Therefore, Africans framed the Mau Mau War on the lines of their microcosm ethnic communities, which they usually evolved wherever they went in the colony. And this scenario replicated itself in our environment over and over again in Kenya's post-colony. That's why normally it's not uncommon to see the liberal use of such inward-looking spatial labels as Kisii Ndogo, small Kisii in Nairobi, or Kisumu Ndogo in Mombasa. Even in our present very more cosmopolitan spaces. And this is normally done in ways which evoke nostalgic attachment to home, real or imagined. But also this says a lot about our feelings of security or insecurity, comfort or discomfort, and a way of confronting the idea of the unknown tomorrow through the lenses of identity and familiar social networks. Now, in the changeover to independence, and I'm using changeover very strongly. I'm using the word changeover very strongly. I happen to be an admirer of Frederick Cooper's work, The Past of the Present, Africa after 1940. After the changeover to independence, land continued to be what I'm seeing as a festering wound in Kenya's violence-prone electoral politics because of its intricate interlocking with the issues of identity. The country increasingly became less shy to desensitize the long-drawn identities and what I see as the historical baggage, which make land a very emotive subject. There is little contemporary evidence when I look around to suggest that this has changed meaningfully this changed meaningfully in our history. Now, as colonialism ended, it was actually land that fragmented the emerging African nationalist leadership on the visions of Kenya's futures, its governance, and even international relations. The British-driven Lancaster House conferences, the spirit of accommodation and compromise, which characterized the negotiations for the much hybrid independence or Uhuru, could actually not materialize into a universally acceptable redistributive justice on matters land. At independence, therefore, the land question was not solved, but postponed under the cloud of the exaggerated euphoria of being free at last. Being free at last. It was partially what provided what I see as fodder for and fueled the political campaigns of not yet Uhuru, not yet independence in Kenya's post-colony in the 1960s and 70s. And we know the Ndungu report, the report that of a commission that was put in place by President by the Kenyan government to look at into land injustices. And I like quoting what they say about the issue of land. Let me get the quote here. Yes, a quote. Land retains a focal point in Kenya's history. It was the basis upon which the struggle for independence was waged. It has traditionally dictated the path of our nationhood. It continues to command a pivotal position in the country's socio, economic, political, and legal relations, quote clauses. You see, I have on the weight of the single party dispensation under the Kenyatta 1 and the Moi administrations, there was a way in which the land question was somewhat kept under wraps, and understandably so. Despite that, I have a feeling that it remained latently an explosive issue. In different localities, individuals, groups and communities ordinarily continued to appropriate land through the lenses of micro-level milieus of kinship and community entitlement, as well as, of course, expedient autochthonous claims. Such interlocked ethnic aspirations in independent Kenya, just like in the previous era, especially among the agrarian communities, were built around two cornerstone cultural paradigms. One, of course, is the one I alluded to earlier when I was quoting Lonsdale, a very long drawn cultural quote in Lonsdale's words, civic virtue, whose moral bearing is derived from working the land and earning respect and honor within the context of communitarian existence. Secondly, there were the ethnic aspirations deriving from claims to and on land based on expediently resurrected histories, very expediently resurrected, brought up histories of the connections necessary for the well-being of a given group on one hand, and the temporal as well as spatial phenomena on the other. One of the very last papers I read this morning is Lonsdale's read a letter on Kipra land that was given by the colonial government to the Sudanese, who could later rename themselves Nubians for purposes of recreating and creating their identity. However, the monolithic political spaces and structures of the first 2 decades of independence lasted only enough to provide what I see as a lull instead of a solution to the land question in Kenya. Even the lull could only last so much because it thrived on what I see as the altars of autocracy. But as we all know, the bubble burst in the 1990s. The festering wound that land had been for long opened up much wider than before, owing to the reintroduction of plural politics in the country in 1991. You know, so the question, friends, is how then was land tied to elections? What is the historical nexus between land and elections? Or in the first place, is there such a thing? Let me spend a few moments answering that. Kenya had a short stint of multi-party politics in the independence elections of the 1950s and the early 60s, 1957 and 1961 to be particular. The significance of these elections was not in temporality, but in the racial inclusivity that they came with. Africans voted for the first time after several decades of disenfranchisement. But what we find is that in no time, what they gained in active political participation, they lost in the dissipated political space when Kenya became a de facto one-party state. This followed from the African-wide quasi-scientific arguments that plural politics could breed division in the newly independent countries, which the founding fathers said they badly needed unity. You know, from Nkrumah from Ghana, my namesake Kenneth Kaunda from Zambia, Nyerere just next door, and our own Mzee Kenyatta. We, in their view and vision, we needed unity badly. But further, a real possibility of intra-Kenya fragmentation actually fed directly by the ideological influences of the Cold War, helped to rationalize this warped notion that plurality was a political luxury which Africa could not afford at the time. But since this argument hinged on the aprons of the Cold War, the single party state in Kenya, like elsewhere in Africa, imploded with the end of the bipolar international structures in the early 90s. You know, it experienced what I see as a death knell in the face of the resultant campaign or whirlwinds of political change that literally forced upon Kenya plurality, leading to the 1992 elections. Now, following the reintroduction of plural politics, the country witnessed waves of what is variously, not least ambiguously, referred to as tribal classes, ethnic violence, land clashes. You know, we use so many concepts to describe this. In many of the cases before and after the elections of 1992, 1997, culminating in the Armageddon of 2007, 2008 elections, land constituted a critical stimulus for ethnic community mobilization. Such a mobilization was, as indicated above, framed on the same old lines of we against them, we against they. I like reading the works of Shriram and Rigon on identities, and they have examined this very well. In many areas in the country, it was clear that the influence of ethnicity, or if not ethnicity, some level of group consciousness in electoral processes was pronounced in areas which access to resources of state patronage was significant in staking claim to land. The case of Molo is what I've read quite widely, and I thank my friends from Kenya Land Alliance for availing quite a bit of documents on this. The case of Crusade and many others. Here, it was more about land than elections in some way. In these areas, people coalesced around the primeval social structures of quote unquote othering us and others, to gain, retain, or perpetuate access to land. The situation was not confined to the 1992 election campaign, but recent studies, especially a study that I read by one student of our own, Omuro, from South Africa, has done a very nice study on issues of weaponized othering and how it has been used for or against the Luo community. He indicates that this situation was not confined to 1992 election campaign, but they dominated the periods before that. In these situations, aspirations of domination or fear of isolation really enhanced identity-based polarization, leading into electoral violence every time there were electoral campaigns. The classic case that I think of is the clash between the followers of Kenya People's Union, KPU, and those of Kenya African National Union, KANU, in 1969, following the Kenyatta 1, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga fallout. Now, in more recent years, as I come to the end, evidence shows the fascination of Kenyans with weaponized othering, others, us and others. For example, in a study of the 2007 elections, Roxana Guadres Romero of the University of Oxford, the Center for the Study of African Economies, concluded, and I quote, although the victims of violence could prefer that political parties are no longer allowed to organize in ethnic or religious lines, they are more likely to identify themselves in ethnic terms and support the use of violence and avoid relying on the police to resolve disputes. Friends, it is noteworthy that in 92, 97, and 2007, violence took place mainly in those areas which have arable land and a long history of multiple claims to land by different communities, such as Molo. Therefore, the association with land or lack of it was actually a key framework in localized understanding of intercommunity relations and its corollary, ethnicization of macro level politics and governance. For example, the attack from the owners of land was based on two objectives. One is to disfranchise the foreigners, in quotes. I don't want to use the term madoadoa, foreigners, in order to deny them a political voice and hence prevent their access to state patronage in protecting their right to land. Second, there was the goal of settling scores, literally, on the basis of strong notions against those people seen as occupying other people's land. Now, studies have actually shown that in many of these clashes and subsequent mass displacement, state agency had an invisible hand in them. Simply, this was, in my view, because of officers of the state, like the culprits and victims of land clashes, who are actually Kenyans, who did not have to work very hard to abate violence. There was no doubt that security officers in many of these places, with the proverbial orders from above, understood that electoral reality was one of the surest ways of accessing the legacy of state patronage, which was paramount in defending individual or group claims to land. In many areas, particularly in the Rift Valley, official security action towards violence and destruction of property was predominant either by tactical inaction or token efforts of quelling the violence without necessarily apprehending the culprits or protecting the victims. Now, although 92, as I finish, and the 97 elections were marred by land clashes in many parts of the Rift Valley, the coast, Transmara, Borabu, very close to my home. The coalition of ethno-regional leaders underwrote what I see as a shockingly peaceful transition in 2002, which saw the end of Moi's 24 years rule. The euphoria and celebrations which followed, I think, were very short-lived. This was because the drama of what was seen as President Moi's downfall yielded some kind of false transition. There wasn't any meaningful transitional justice owing to the pervasive nature in Kenya's national psyche of the enduring inward-looking structures of identity that were very limited in resolving challenges of inclusion and exclusion. Let me make some concluding remarks now. Friends, the central project of this paper was to appreciate the role of continuity, culled from long-drawn historical processes in shaping identity. It is deployment, it is content, and its social essence in Africa. The gist of the argument was that in Kenya's history, identity invariably provided critical reference for negotiating and renegotiating trajectories of societal entitlements, a sense of belonging, dominance, inclusion, or isolation. But it did so in ways that were more antagonistic than integrative. And therefore, electoral politics became, over the years, what I see as a near perfect arena in which such contradictory processes happened most, with land and emotive claims on and to it providing a spark which often ignited violence, then as it does in our time. Also, I made an attempt, just an attempt, to use historical ideas, institutions, and relationships to explain what I called earlier the Kenyan crisis, manifest in intersections of land, violence, and identity. I predicated my ideas on what sociologists believe, and I drew upon the ideas of the Indian sociologist Satish Saprel that I named earlier, that complex societal processes have continuities over the long term. And these are the continuities that shape institutions, shape identities, interactions, and the patterns of conduct. Saprel sees some kind of hierarchy in these processes of continuity, in which Some processes are more lasting in controlling society than others. I hope, friends, I have demonstrated that at critical junctures of Kenya's history, there was an unbreakable knack for the deployment of inward-looking cultural resources that are readily available to serve intra-group interest at the expense of all others around. Therefore, what I'm saying, friends, is that combining the posteriori epistemology of social science that decipher the complex congruence of institutions, relationships, and ideas that shape society with the historical interpretation based on our usual binary of change and time, humanity and agency, as well as space and specificity, in my view, unravels a socio-cultural theology of how the conjunctions of land, identity, and the electoral violence have invariably provided an unholy trinity, which has made Kenya a paradox of a country that is often too close to and yet too far from the precise or the apice.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'll just summarize Dr. Ombongi's discussion in three ways. And I'll focus on the question of land and how that over time and space, it has influenced the relationships between communities, whether it was pre-colonial, colonial to post-colonial Kenya. The first point that Dr. Ombongi tried to do was to question the notion that pre-colonial economic organizing or organization, which emphasizes distributive justice as a given, is a fallacy that in many ways, even within the context of pre-colonial Kenya or pre-colonial Africa, there was a tendency for communities to still go back to their cocoons and organize in smaller ways than, the generalized notion of distributive justice, including land, as a given. The second level is when you consider colonialism. His argument is that colonialism then entrenched the inequalities that we experienced in colonial Kenya and continued in the post-colonial period. And that in post-colonial Kenya, and I liked that notion of distributive justice was postponed. And it looks like distributive justice, particularly with regard to land, has continuously been postponed, including the famous Ndungu report, which was well-meaning, but somehow just thrown through the window, and we are still grappling on the question of land. And therefore, tied to land, the people then tend to go back to their cocoons, go back to their small spaces, universes that Dr. Ombongi calls, to organize themselves. And in the process, therefore, in that organizing themselves, then you create the us versus them. And therefore, it's played out very well in the election period. Just those 2 3 points that I think I would just summarize Dr. Ombongi's treatise. Let's take the opportunity to raise questions. We'll first take a first round of questions. We'll do 4 questions from those present, and then we can also take other questions. So let's begin with the audience present. Right, we see the first one there. Question? Yes, Kefa? Another question? David, and then Dr. Nyanchoga. Please, let's begin with you.
Check. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. for this information. I seek to understand from you two issues. As you pointed out and quoted Professor Ndungu report, is that land was the basis through which struggle for independence was based. And you observed that even after gaining independence, land issues were not solved. My question is, why didn't African leaders solve their own land issues? Why was it not solved? Bearing in mind that in Kenya, we have a ministry specifically for land and a national commission specifically for land. Then how comes land issues are not solved in Kenya? Now, the second question is, your paper has looked at land, electoral politics, and identity, and has given it a title, The Unholy Trinity. I hope my pastor will not hear this. But my question is, what makes the three become unholy? And at what point do these three become unholy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ombongi, for a very incisive presentation, which really teased out the variables that are really supposed to be, taken to be the cause of the ever continuing conflict in this country. Because looking at the three variables that, Dr. you've identified land, you've also identified electoral politics, and you've also identified ethnicity, which is an identity or other. And you've so far so good really elaborated on what identity in this case is, of which you're saying that it's very elastic. Indeed, I agree, because looking at Rokajulu's book, I think he talks about the deliberalization or the politicization of ethnicity in the country, of which he says that Kenya has a tendency of making 3 steps forward, then 3 steps backward. So on that very basis of Rokajulu's argument, because he was looking at the scenarios whereby in 1992, the ethnic identity, which is very salient, held back the march towards, the much needed, liberalization of the much needed solution to the land problem or to the other problems that the country has been witnessing. But ethnicity, with its salience, still held Kenya back. In 1997, you remember the Likoni clashes. Then Rokajulu was posing a question in that book, 3 steps, 1 step forward, 3 steps backward, that there seems to be no end in sight to the underlying factors that cause this protracted conflict that we see in the country. So my question is, why do you really see to it that it's land? Because of the 3 variables, I could really interpret that you point to land as the centerpiece or as the central theme around which electoral conflict occur, and identity crisis also occur. Yet in my interpretation, it seems as the very fact that the state has not been a position to rein in its ethnic politics, which Rokajulu says is politicized. So why do you want to, maybe according to me, why do you want to give a lot of, premise to land as the main cause of this, mayhem that we've seen in the country? Thank you.
Thank you, Mwalimu. I think what I wanted to ask has already been asked by the first gentleman who asked a question. Because for a very long time, it's almost 60 years now, we are always talking about this issue of land every other 5 years, which tallies together with the election cycle. But then at the same time, we have the most elaborate institutions that are mandated and facilitated to be able to address land issues. From a simplistic point of view, you would have imagined that a simple undertaking like title deeds would solve maybe 90% of the problems. And we have the capacity to do it. I think throughout 2020, 2021, I've seen Farida Karonei trying to explain what our ministry is doing in terms of digitization, very elaborate cooperation partnership with Google to provide these solutions. But they don't seem to go away. Why can't we just solve this with issuing of title deeds, for example? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. You know, you are my chairman, the department, for that presentation. My question is more or less the same as to what one or two of my colleagues here have asked. I just wanted to disagree with you. It's more of a comment and a disagreement on that aspect where we connect land and electoral politics. I want to look at the backyard where I come from. And you know very well, you have talked about it, Borabu, Soptic border. I want to say one thing, that this is a question of isolated cases. It also depends on the nature of ownership of the land, whether people are squatters, whether people have title deeds, the way Mwalimu Kure is raising it. If I look at, Borabu, for example, we have had mayhem every other time we have elections. And, people argue, about land ownership, where these people came from. You need to push you backwards. But you see, if you look at the people who occupy land around that region, this is land that is illegally owned. This is land whereby people have title deeds. So I think the argument then is so deceptive. And in part, I want to disagree that really, electoral politics, electoral violence cannot be connected to issues of land, largely in some cases. I don't know what tech you have for this. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, friends and the colleagues, for those eye-opening questions. This is a learning process. I learn new things every day. This is a work in progress. This is the second place I'm presenting this, and I was looking for the kind of comments that some of you are making, and thank you very much from the outset. Now, Mukaya, why leaders did not resolve land issues in Kenya from the outset, from independence? My first response is in what I emphasized as changeover. I was very careful not to use the word independence. Mokaya, what I call changeover. What changed over is power from one group of elites to the other group of elites. I've referred you to Freddie Cooper, who talks about independence more as a transition, not the freedom to do stuff. The bedrock of colonialism largely remained intact. And since land was at the center of it all, then now you know. Read session of paper number 10, African Socialism. I see it as African socialism that did not have socialism. Mukaya, that was African socialism that did not have socialism. Because if it had socialism, we could have not talked about willing buyer, willing seller in terms of resettlement and the change of land appropriation mechanism in the immediate post-colonial period. That's my first answer. The second one, the first generation of African leaders in Kenya, Mzee Kenyatta in particular, was very much aware of history. And he knew how he had been demonized by the colonial regime. In fact, Governor Evelyn Berry described him during the declaration of the state of emergency in October 20th, 1952, as the leader unto death and darkness. If you read the book, Jomo's Jailer, you know the many attempts that were made to make sure that probably it doesn't come out. And if he comes out very weak. But then he came out a bit stronger than they thought. So his greatest agenda, if I understand it well, when he takes the reins of leadership in the country, was actually not to rock the boat. And not rocking the boat meant leaving the sleeping dog called land continue. Just after he had become the prime minister, he was scheduled to address a meeting of white settler farmers in Nakuru. This is a famous meeting, it's very well known. And when he was going there, he was accompanied by the young leaders of the time, Dr. Kiano, Dr. Njoroge Mungai, who were very vibrant and passionate, whose agenda was Mzungu aende wilaya, Mwafrika apate nini? Uhuru. So as they were consulting on their way to Nakuru, Mzee was asking them, so what do we tell these guys? The record we have says Njoroge and Kiano told him, tell them off. Tell them that we have acquired our independence, and the next thing they need to do is to pack up and do what? And leave. Mzee Kenyatta got there. In fact, a clip of his address to them is in YouTube. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, I want to let you know that I'm not a god. I have made my own mistakes. I have come here to tell you that forgive me, because I have also forgiven you. And we are out here wanting to create a Kenya for everybody. Black, white, brown, for as long as you are willing to remain here, Kenya has a future. with all the multiple races involved. Nobody is going to take anybody's thing. Whatever you get, you must work for it. That's why I came up with the clarion call of uhuru na nini? Na kazi, independence and work. So he didn't want to rock the boat. And the best way of rocking the boat was to touch the issue of land, because that was the bedrock of the colonial agrarian economy, and we inherited it directly. Your second question is, what makes the three unholy? And what time did it become unholy? The first part of the question is easier. It's unholy because when all of them intersect, you know what happens. People die. Property destroyed. When the three come together, every time. That is what makes them unholy, because that is an affront to peace and stability, in my view. When? It's a very interesting question. If you realize that my presentation did not have dates, because I want to argue that we need to begin looking at our history in a long, drawn process, instead of chopping it into portions that are a bit disconnected and give what I described as an atomized view of our society. That's a sociological concept. You know, you break it down into small portions that might not be speaking to each other. So when I will let you know that it's as old as it is, or it's as old as Kenya. When you want to place that entity called Kenya, when did it begin? Odembo, your question reminded me a book that Philip Ochieng wrote. I accuse the press, and you are accusing me of accusing land. But I've partially answered your question as I was answering Alex, because if you look at Kenya, in fact, again, it's unfortunate that Longser left the online platform. That was my teacher in Cambridge. He has described Kenya at the beginning of the colonial era as a patchwork of a country, which was only variable as a footbath to Uganda. It is only until it was discovered that it has fertile lands that it became something. So colonialism was about land. Independence was about land. And the way things go, even today's Kenya, is in a sense about land. Land made Kenya, not the other way. That is why when Odembo, I see it as the fulcrum that holds the fairly violent history of our country. What I see as a social crisis. Mwalimu Kiule, more or less the same question. Why has the problem not been resolved? We have not resolved it because we postpone it all the time. The Ndungu report was not about resolving the problem. It was about to provide a momentary lull so that we get convinced that government is doing something. Akiumi report, you know, our official covers are full of these reports. but ask about the implementation of the recommendations. We have not even touched the Justice and the Reconciliation Commission report. I told some students that the other day in class, and one of them genuinely asked me, where is it? The Kiblagat report. Dr. Nyanchoga, well, you know, academics include disagree with one another, and I'm glad you are disagreeing. I agree with you that there is a sense in which contingency can explain some of the problems that we have had in a number of places in the country, particularly with regard to elections. The Borabu, for example, I know that's your home area. You know, the centrality or what I see as the fetish about land and what it does to the two communities in both sides of the Borabu-Sotik border. Land is what brings them together. Land is also what divides them. It is not about elections. Let me give you an example. In 2007, 2008, generally, the people of Nyamira, where Borabu is, and the people of Bomet and the other side, Kericho and all that, voted on the same side. Why were they fighting during the post-election violence? That is when Jibilat was burned down completely, and that's when they killed the prominent professor, I think Maranga. Yes. So why were they fighting? When they were on the same side of the two voting blocks, the PNU and ODM. They were all ODM. The center is claims to a sense of belonging. Belonging means land, which is actually real or imagined. The nostalgic feelings of the Kepsigis wanting to move the border to Metamaywa, which is how many kilometers from the border? 10 to 15 kilometers. The reply from the Kisii side of things is that we want to move the border to Kabianga, because even the name Kabianga is Kisii. Kabianga is right in Kericho, where the university is. So, Doc, it's really about land, whether tangible or imagined, created or recreated. Yes.
More or less similar questions that people online have asked. One is, how does Kenya break this curse of negative intra-community inward looking for us to have distributive justice? The other question is, how can Kenya resolve this said unholy trinity? The third one is referring to not rocking the boat. So if it was not rocking, I mean, Kenyatta didn't want to rock the boat. What was the role of patronage grant system, which has infested Kenya, you know, the Kenya government, and particularly the distributive policies that the Kenya government has enacted over the years? The last one, how did the 2010 Kenya Constitution shape or influence the unholy trinity? I have my own question. Sorry to abuse my position as a coordinator at this point. How does greed influence the intersection of land, violence, and identity in explaining the continuities that you've tried to demonstrate? The second one, my own, is individualized land ownership a pre-colonial legacy, or is it a colonial vestige? Thank you.
Thank you, Mwalimu Gona. Maybe I will start with your questions. Greed. As you talked, I was wondering, how do we problematize greed as a category that we can use in analysis? That is the challenge I will have if I had to talk about greed. That does, for example, greed mean owning 1,000 acres of land in an environment where 80% of the people own none? Is that a parameter that we can use to measure greed? That problem notwithstanding, the problem of operationalizing it notwithstanding, you know, greed, issues of land sometimes comes dressed up as community interest. Again, we have gone back to our normal. Community interest. Our son is being finished. That's a common. So, in my view, Malim, that is where the challenge is. Yeah, that is where the challenge is, that many of the things that touch on land, there's a way in which they interlock with our creation and recreation of identities, which keep changing constantly and consistently. So that's a challenge I have, but it still becomes part of identity issues, if you asked me. I missed your second question, talking about individual land ownership.
Is it a pre-colonial legacy, or is it a colonial vestige? The same, is it still the continuity that you're describing?
A colonial legacy, yes. Pre-colonial, I'm not sure, because in pre-colonial Africa, you see more concepts of community and the communitarian living, where access to land or lack of it was mediated by custom and ritual in ways that had social controls, that even those who didn't own it, there is a way in which social controls took care of them. I'm reminded of Godfrey Murioki's work on the Gikuyu, and what they call them, they are Ahoi. Who are the Ahoi? Huh? Dr. Gaje, who are the Ahoi? Yes, tenants at will. So I see it more as both a legacy and a vestige of colonialism. I could read more to understand this, but that's the way I see it. Can we break from this curse? How I wish. The inward looking and the utilitarian approach to identities. If you force me to look at things futuristically, we say we are historians. If we can be prophets, we are prophets of the past. I would say that we will need to do deliberate transformation, which will be characterized by genuine embracing of the neoliberal notions of equality, meritocracy. You can name all those nice things, which I said, insofar as they exist among ourselves, we only use them as a whip towards authority. If we embrace them, then I foresee some bright future. But if we continue the way we are, our future will not be very different from our history. I'm not a prophet of doom, and as I say, the historians, we are not prophets. Patron-client relationship, I characterized it as the legacy of Kenya's post-colonial state. And part of that is what makes us recreate and create, renegotiate, and configure our identities in order to gain access to state patronage. There is a document I said I read last night entitled Sons of the Soil. It's a paper by Lonsdale, which he did immediately after the post-election violence of 2008, and looks at the violence in Kipra. The very clear thing that that paper establishes is how access to state patronage has its benefits, whether you're talking about the colonial state or the post-colonial state. The Sudanese who were brought mainly as soldiers to help the British to conquer and control many of the colonies of this region. They were settled virtually in every colonial town in Kenya. And you know, in the social geography of colonialism, the locating of what could become Nubians was determined by the fact that they were considered to be non-natives. So as non-natives, they were a little bit more privileged within the colonial matrix of domination and control. And in a sense, that is what has been their curse, if you looked at it clearly. And in the article, Lonsdale establishes that part of how they have handled the challenge that they face is to constantly recreate their identities in ways that try to seek access to state patronage, because they are pure products of the state. They were brought in by the colonial state. If you go to every colonial town, there's a Nubian village. In my own hometown in Kisii, there's a place called Bonubi, to refer to a Nubian settlement. You know, Nakuru, Nairobi, Mombasa. We know that. The 2010 Constitution, a wonderful document. In fact, is probably the most liberal constitution that you can find, I think, in the continent. You know, putting legal instruments in place has never been our problem. Putting policies in place has never been our problem. Friends, I spent about 4 years reading documents on malaria control policy in Kenya. Were it not that I was coming from Kenya, I was coming from some country in space, I couldn't have thought that malaria is a problem. Because document after document talking about mechanisms put in place to control malaria. In fact, if you read Professor John Hailey's book, The East African Doctors, 1997, about 70% of the budget of the Ministry of Health was dedicated to malaria control and treatment, almost. Is malaria still a problem here? Hello? It is. It is. So my view is that the 2010 Constitution is wonderful. It has wonderful provisions that will sort out many things, not just land. How much of it have we implemented? Your guess is as good as mine. Malima, I think I've responded to what I have here. Is there anything online? Please bring it up.
There are two who have raised their hands. Faith Alube and Paul Muiru. Let's begin with the Faith. Unmute Faith. Faith, go ahead.
You can hear me? You can hear me? You can hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you, Faith. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ombongi. That was a great presentation. My name is Faith Alube. I'm the director of the Kenya Land Alliance. And I've just been hearing the comments about being brought up about your presentation. I'd just like to make 2 or 3 comments. Number one, the conflicts around land cannot end simply because we appreciate Article 260 of our Constitution that talks about land as what is beneath, what's on the surface, what we walk on, and what's in the air, renewable energy. When you look at what is beneath, that's what multinationals are coming to do in Africa, to plunder the resources that we have in Africa. As long as they're around, and as long as open contract is not something that is encouraged, conflict will never. Here in Kenya, concessions are. Look at what is on the surface. What we work on is finite. It will never expand. So it's a source of power. It gives someone. It gives, especially if you're a politician, you just feel like grabbing more of it. You never get tired of getting more and more of it. A case in point is the expiring leaseholds that were given in between 1899. You talked about tenants at will, and the subsequent law, the Land Alienation Act of 1921, amended in 1925, amended in 1927, which gave the colonial administration a right to have legitimacy over land, Kenyan land, and they introduced the regimes that we have. Back then it was customary government land and private land, and titled men were given title deeds. So on the surface that we work, that is the conflict. It will never end as long as titled men, quote unquote, need more of it. As long as titled men feel like they need to grab more of it in order to be more powerful. And then in the air, when you talk about renewable energy, right now we are moving to clean energy. We are moving from oil and gas as the primary source of energy, and we are moving to green energy. As long as documents are still having macro level language, there'll always be conflict, because the traditional knowledge of indigenous communities that they used to use to manage climate or to manage renewable energy is not considered as a work way of doing things. Conflict will always be there. That is my first comment. My second comment has to do with the definition of property. I'd say that we need to define what property is to us today. A long time ago, I can say, let me not use the term long time ago. I'd say previously, we've always known land is what you work on, land is what you pay for, and you get a title deed. When you get a title deed, your issues are solved. But 70% of our country is communally held lands and they are not registered. Does it mean non-registered lands are not owned? Are they idle and unowned and occupied? So the aspect of property and proving if this is my property and the aspect of inherent land should be defined. We should define that a title deed endorses an existing right, especially for communities. We have new prospects, like especially around lakes and Lake Victoria, and I think also the Indian Ocean, where people are leasing water the way we lease land, 50 by 100, 100 by 100, an acre, and they put fish cages and they pay rates. That is also a property right that is emerging. Who is taking these rates and how are they taking it? So the concept of property, I think it is so dynamic when it comes to land, and I've defined what land is according to Article 260. And then my last comment has to do with the concept of subdivision. There's someone who spoke about subdivision, if it is pre-colonial, colonial, or post-colonial. I'd say pre-colonial, we had nations and they had their land, territories, which they defended the best way they knew how. And that's what we were used to when the colonial administration came in and through the Land Alienation Act and the ordinances, and then you move on to Maurice Carter Commission of 1957, the Swinnerton Plan. All these were plans to zone land and to be able to make it profitable according to them, according to their own definition. So subdivision might not be ideal in certain situations, but it's something that it was there. There was a concept of it before independence. And then during independence, they linked it with economic, let me call economic aspects of land, that they had to translate the land rights into an economic right. So as we speak about this, I'd just like to conclude and say that there's need to share more about this, because we can say that the CS, there's someone who mentioned CS Karuni, has done so much. But what is so much if duty bearers are moving without the right holders? An example is the digitization process. If a duty bearer can sit in a boardroom and decide to digitize land records, the whole of Kenya, and I'm an elite in Nairobi, in my own house, Wi-Fi is a privilege. So how will my grandmother in my village back at home use such, and they cannot submit physical documents? If the government wants to register communally held lands, which is 70% of our lands, and yet it is self-resourced, a community in Masai is made up of 10,000 persons. How are they going to get together to form a community assembly, to come up with the register, to develop a survey map which would be accepted? So as we talk about policy, we should also know that as long as duty bearers are not moving with right holders, it is just a piece of paper. The 2010 Constitution is very progressive, but it does not have life. Enforcement is still a problem, lack of awareness. Most of our communities are lay communities. Let me stop there. I can talk until tomorrow. Thank you very much, Dr. Ombongi, and I'll look for you once I'm back in Nairobi. It was a pleasure listening to the lecture. Asante.
Can I come through this poll? Can you hear me? Dr. Ombongi, can I go on?
Go on.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Paul from the north of Cambridge. I am happy to have heard the presentation of Dr. Ombongi, but very briefly because of time, I want to make just one question to you. Now, I realized in your presentation that you did go beyond 2007, 008 violence. I realized, though you had no date in a presentation. Now, does that suggest that possibly devolution and county governance can slam the brakes on the cycle of violence in Kenya? Because I imagine no governor would wish to have his county being, being a center of violence and therefore chasing away potential investors. And so in my view, there are some optimistic opportunities that we can grab as a nation and begin to address the perpetual violence on land and elections in Kenya. And two, I think this thing might be beaten. I want to hear your view about this. You are having so many people in urban areas, a new category of Kenyans coming up who are neither native nor a settler. My own sons, I'm a Kikuyu, wife is a Kalenjin. Wherever I go, I don't think they're at home on either side, or possibly they're at home on both sides. So I think it is possible in the next one generation to overcome the cycle of violence, because ethnicity is being beaten slowly by slowly in smaller spaces, especially from the urban areas. That's my view, but I want to hear your views about the 2 points I have raised. Thank you so much.
Respond to those comments and questions. Maybe two more observations or questions so that we can wrap up. Fidelis is asking, do you see any continuity of the post-colonial state's rejection of redistributive politics at independence as we go into elections 2022? The other question is, what are your thoughts on the ownership valuation of land that make land ownership only a privilege of the elite and eventually builds up on generational injustices, including what you refer to as neoliberal concepts? Thank you.
All right. Let me begin with Paul. Emma, Paul says he's from Cambridge, speaking from Cambridge. It reminds me of the seminar room at the African Studies Center, second floor, where we used to have seminars, and Newcourt 5, St. John's College, where we used to have the African History Seminar. All right, Paul, I like your optimism about the new generation of Kenyans. You are describing them as urban. Yes, urban. But then if you scratch beyond the surface, you will probably be forced to revise that. Because one, many of these guys you are seeing as urban actually what again, don't know whether it was Atieno Diambo who described them as straddlers. They straddle between the rural and the urban. Yeah. And they are neither rural nor urban. They are somewhere in some space. And the way they recreate their identities is what suits them at what time. So I like the optimism, but I also say we don't have to be overly optimistic when you analyze things beyond the surface. I guess he's referring, for example, to our children and their generation. And the only thing that does not make them belong to the communities where they belong is actually that a number of them don't speak what people of my generation will consider as the first language. But then, I don't know, but I have a feeling that they become more nostalgic of these micro-level identities as they grow older. And this could be the people who are settling in what I call Kisindogo, Kisumundogo, and attending ceremonies and rituals. I'm calling them rituals that speak to these macro level identities. So I think, Paul, we are a long way off, if you ask me. I don't want to be futuristic. I've never trained to be futuristic, but we are a long way off. Now, Ms. Faith Alube, she's the CEO of Kenya Land Alliance, and very instrumental in enabling me to get some of the data that I've used. And we always have these debates with Faith about land. She comes from a purely legal perspective, comes from an academic historical perspective, and our debates never end. And for sure, if we had a chance, we can continue forever. Where we agree is about the general inability in implementing the 2010 constitution that's very discernible in our Mideast. And we have had a long history of that. So Faith, thank you. For example, they sent me about 200 to 300 pages of cases of how the current crop of politicians, as we go on the campaign, where land has become an issue and a very important tool for campaign in different parts of the country. And we will let the dust settle down before we start using the material. And that answers, I think it was Paul, who asked why I stopped at 2007, 2008. That was very deliberate. 2013, 2017, 2022, we will begin seeing patterns clearly with time. But if you give some of the developments we are seeing in our Mideast, the long durée approach, they speak very well to some of the trends that I alluded to in my presentation. Now, Videlis, I guess it's Videlis, our student. Very interesting question whether he sees rejection of redistribution justice in the 1960s. Yes, rejection might not be the concept that I want to use. The concept I used is that is what constituted not rocking the boat. If you remember, I used that concept. That is, and it's very clearly contained in the policy of pronouncements that followed. I didn't understand the second question. If you can please bring it forth.
So another gentleman, not Fidelis, he said, what are your thoughts on the ownership valuation of land that make land ownership only a privilege of the elite and eventually builds up on generational injustices?
Well, That's one of the enduring features of land in this country. That it's an elite issue. And fundamentally, it's an elite problem. Fundamentally. The word there is fundamentally. And it begins with the gradual end of community ownership of land that we inherit from our pre-colonial past. And as I said, colonialism had a very fundamental way in which it was about land, because the value of Kenya lay in the land, and we basically continued that. So my view is that that has been a challenge in our history, and it appears to me that it will remain so, to avoid the risk of being futuristic. I'm repeating that for another time.
Much, Dr. Ombongi, for your presentation and responses to the queries and issues that were raised with those present and those online. I'd like to invite Dr. Nyanchoga to give a vote of thanks, and we end this afternoon's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Session Chair. You know, I don't want to refer you to as chairman. I want to be very, very accurate and refer to you as Session Chair and the rapporteur for the program. I want to thank everyone else who has come here. But first and foremost, let me say that we want to thank the management of this building for affording us the space. This is indeed a very comfortable space for academics like this. Secondly, I want to really appreciate and thank and congratulate my chairman of Department of History on the one hand, and also as a presenter. Today I've learned something new. I've learned something to the effect of the interface between land, elections or elective politics, and identity. And you have said in my mind when you said that what I'm experiencing back home is more imaginary than real. In fact, you answered me very well. I want to thank everyone who has made it to this place, the diversity, of course, we are seeing around. I can see Chair Department of Literature is here. She's seated there very quietly. If you don't notice her very well, you might think she's a student. She's a very senior person in the university. I want to thank my colleagues who have come. I want to thank the administrator, our visitors. I may not know you, but obviously, if you are here, then you are interested in history. I want to thank our students from undergraduate to postgraduate. Finally, last but not least, we have to thank our technical staff who have made sure that the program sails through comfortably. My name is Dr. Penny Nyanchoga from the Department of History. I am an archaeologist by profession. Thank you very much. I hand it over to you, Rapporteur and the Session Chair.
Thanks for the emphasis of session chair, because the chair, substantive chair, is here. I don't want to overstretch the thanks because Ben has done it. Let's have a good evening. We are continuing with the dialogues next week and another week. I think we have about 4 or 5, no, I think 4 remaining presentations. So, sorry, more than that. Oh, okay. So we're still on. We'll continue, and when we close for the break, we resume more discussions from September. And by the way, we seem to be full. There's a lot of interest in the presentations. Our friend Emma, has accepted to also give a paper, and we'll be really happy to have you around. Others say thank you very much. Bye.